Jazz is said to have the fundamental rhythms of human life. This means that jazz is connected to how we think and who we are inside. That was a famous quote by Louis Armstrong. He says, "If you gotta ask, you'll never know." That means jazz is all about your expression. How you feel and how you convey your music is basically the essence and the beauty of jazz. So, there are so many different types of jazz. Just to name a few, there's pre-jazz, ragtime, Dixieland, Tin Pan Alley, boogie woogie, swing, big band, scat, bebop, cool, hard bop, West Coast, free jazz, bossa nova, fusion, neo-pop, soul jazz, Afro-Latina, acid jazz, world fusion, neoclassical, modern creative, and in memoriam. So we're going to touch on a few of these later on. So I'm going to break my speech up into three parts. First, there's going to be the past of jazz, where it came from, the present, where jazz is right now, and the future, where jazz is going. Off of the information I give you, we're going to make our own conclusion of where jazz is going. So it all started about 400 years ago in Africa. The first thing you may think of when you think of Africa, African culture and African music, is the drums and rhythm that you hear. So it all started in Africa. Then, of course, the English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish were competing over the slave trade. And they dragged the Africans from their homeland to the new Americas. But that didn't mean that the Africans left their culture behind with them. They took it over with them to the New World. So what jazz is basically is a mix between African culture and European culture mixed together. So in the 1700s, Creole musicians were the primary inventors of early jazz. Creoles are a mix of people who are of French descent and African descent. And they were the primary inventors of jazz because they had a little bit more freedom than everybody else. Since they weren't completely French, they didn't have all the freedom they could have, but since they weren't completely African, they weren't completely enslaved, so they had, with those African roots, they had a chance to express themselves through music. In the 1800s, by 1807, over 600,000 slaves have been sold into North America, and this was around the time of Jim Crow laws and segregation. But in 1871, a group called the Jubilee Singers of Fisk University held audiences of all white community, which created an awareness of just black music in general. Not necessarily jazz yet, but just black music. But the earliest forms of jazz began in the New Orleans. The French ruled the city and demanded, absolutely needed music all throughout. So it didn't matter if it was a festival or a funeral, there was always music being played in New Orleans. In the 1900s, ragtime and in the New Orleans jazz became popular and nationwide. Some of the big names in ragtime were Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime, Jelly Roll Morton, M.A. Rainey, W.C. Handy, the father of blues. Ragtime was especially popular for its syncopated rhythms, and Joplin's sheet music was so popular that it sold to millions of